ready to start. So we'll start the program. My name is Phil Mjwaha. I'm the Director General in the Department of Science and Innovation during the day. If you'd like to know what I do in the evening, let's meet during the dinner and I'll tell you all about it. So before we start, I think we will have a video which is called an evacuation video, which will just give us guidance on what we need to do if something happens. I hope the video is ready.
Welcome to the Durban ICC, where the world meets Africa. As a leading world-class events facility, we make your safety our #1 priority. Please give us your attention for a few minutes to take you through some important health and safety information. As the Durban ICC is a public space, please remember to keep your personal belongings safe and with you at all times. We have many bathrooms for you to use around the venue. They are clearly marked in the foyer and concourse areas. The Durban ICC is a smoke-free building, but we do have clearly marked smoking zones outside the main entrance and in the courtyards opposite the concourse. Please make use of these areas and the ashtrays provided when you smoke. In the event of a medical emergency, please dial the emergency number 031 360 1111 for assistance. The Durban ICC has developed a very simple emergency evacuation plan that everyone must be familiar with. Our staff are specially trained and will be there to assist you in following this plan. In the event of an evacuation, an announcement will be made to leave the venue. Please remain calm and walk swiftly to the nearest emergency exit in the concourse area. These exit doors are clearly marked. Security guards and the marshals will also help direct you out of the building. Please do not use any lifts or escalators in the event of an emergency. Once outside, you will be directed to the nearest assembly point by the marshals for your safety. Please wait at the assembly point until the venue has been cleared and a marshal deems it safe for you to return to your seats. Thank you for your time and enjoy this event.
Okay, thank you very much. I always like the message in the video that says, when anything happens, calm down. And it always reminds me of the advice I got when I was young, that should you find yourself in front of a lion, don't panic. It's counterintuitive that you remain calm under those circumstances, but nevertheless, I think we have to do that. So I've introduced myself, and then I'd like to make some acknowledgments. We will be soon getting a message from either the mayor or representative from the mayoral office. So the mayor is our host here in Durban whilst we are attending the convention. So I would like to acknowledge the office of the mayor. I would like also to acknowledge the Department of Science and Innovation and all the sponsors, because without the sponsors and the support we get from them, we wouldn't have a successful convention. There are too many to mention in this, but I think they know who they are, and we're extremely grateful for their support. Our Minister of Higher Education, Science and Innovation, who we are acknowledging in absentia, he has agreed to address you, but unfortunately he was called by the President to be outside of South Africa. He is currently, I think, in Indonesia, but he has agreed to address us, but only tomorrow. So you'll have him addressing us tomorrow. We also have vice chancellors, deputy vice chancellors, and CEOs of companies. We are extremely grateful, busy people, that you've made time to be with us either physically or virtually. And I'd like to express my sincere thanks to a number of overseas guests that have agreed to come to the convention. I do know that it's the early days of us getting out of COVID, and sometimes traveling is not easy. So to our overseas guests, we are extremely delighted and honored that you did make the time to come to South Africa. Rest of the African continent, colleagues, again, we are extremely, extremely proud and delighted that you've joined us, and then, of course, guests from the rest of South Africa. So every year, we meet here in Durban, usually at this time, and I was asking the president of Africa Bio, why do you choose this time? He says Durban is one of the places with the best weather. He will be addressing you soon, so you can ask him what he meant by that, because today we obviously are not in a space where we have good weather. But we're here to just really take stock of where the bio-based applications are in the world at this moment. How is the knowledge progressing, and where to from here? And this is coming at an opportune time in South Africa because we were called as the Department of Science and Innovation to provide scientific advice during COVID-19 on how the pandemic was evolving. And you probably all know how, as scientists, on the one hand, you think you are popular by discovering a variant, and on the other hand, the rest of the world hates you, because that's what happened at the time when scientists used science to try and demonstrate the variant and how the pandemic was evolving. But nevertheless, it gave us in South Africa as scientists a platform where the rest of the country got to appreciate the investment in science. There are many, many, many other scientific institutions that were called upon to assist during COVID in the manufacturing of ventilators, manufacturing of diagnosis. So we really are very, very delighted that as we try and find out where the technology is, I suspect that not only in South Africa but in other parts of the world, everyone now have a better appreciation of the investments that are still needed in this area. And of course, to remind ourselves how mankind has benefited from this. Most of you would again know that one of the vaccines that were discovered or were used very, very importantly sort of midway through the pandemic is based on the work that we're doing in this field. So I think the stage is set then to get us going. I will then invite Dr. Nhlanhla Msomi, who is the president of Africa Bio, chairperson of Bioafrica, to come and give us a word of welcome and introduction. So please, a round of applause for Dr. Msomi.
Good morning, everybody, and I would like to welcome everyone to the convention, 2022 convention. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to acknowledge the fact that this is the 5th one. There's a famous story about Winston Churchill and his rudeness, and one of the greatest English playwrights was telling him how awful he was, and inviting him to the opening of his show. And he says, I can't come, but I will come to the third day in case there's a third day, meaning that it wasn't going to survive the opening. I think we had a lot of such sentiments when we started 5 years ago, And I'm grateful to all of you for supporting us in this journey. And I think a little bit of history is useful just to get a sense of where we're coming from. This convention was conceptualized, if I'm not mistaken, 20-odd years ago at Bio in Chicago. And one of the observations that we had been noticing going to Bio was that there was a need for an African platform that would replicate the gains that we were making at Bio in terms of interacting as different stakeholders from across the world. More importantly, the African delegation and the diaspora had a strong view, and so we requested the then Consul of South Africa for America West, Midwest, to host us at a dinner at the consulate. And so the idea was born, and I'm very grateful for the participation of the diaspora as well, in particular. People like Tony Ndefo, who will be joining us later. People like Yemi Onakunle, who is going to be joining us later. They're based in the American West. And a lot of colleagues from across the African continent who have consistently supported us and come to the convention. And I suppose it's the reason why we're here on the 5th year. And unlike Bernard Shaw's play, you guys turned up for the 5th version. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm also, at this year's convention, it's the 3rd day. We started on Saturday. And I've been excited to see the number of startups and students that have joined us. It augurs well for the future. We have startups from across the continent in numbers that are far more than we've ever had, probably 10 times or even 15 times than we've had before. And the diversity in terms of location is quite encouraging. And as we all know, startups and students are the agents that will give meaning to the goals we've set ourselves of indigenous or local innovation to support development. And so to see the number of startups, and I invite everyone to, when the exhibition is open, to go to the exhibition hall and go through the startup stadium. There are some stars there. We will have a startup breakfast on Wednesday where we will honor these startups. So it is an incredible, exciting development to the growth of this convention. The other exciting part has been this weekend. We've had a weekend of courses, Bioentrepreneurship Bootcamp. Again, an incredibly exciting program that has been delivered by our partners at Emory University are here. The startups cannot stop praising and they're excited. So I know that the startups that attended this year, at the very least, they're coming to next year's convention. So there is no risk of the Churchillian curse because those startups would want to come back and enjoy and gain from that interaction. So the weekend has been incredible. Also, the International Center for Genetic Engineering, who have been our partners from the onset, have delivered what I can only call a powerhouse suite of courses. Part of our partnership with the International Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology is that we are hoping to use that platform to drive the development of biotechnology in the continent from the science base up using call it strategic alliances and a very smart way of utilizing IP and driving manufacturing capacity, whether it's in pharmaceuticals, medical innovations, or plant biotechnology, GMOs and stuff like that, biopesticides and biofertilizers. These were the programs that were done this weekend. So thank you to the ICGP. And the problem what I've just started for myself is once you start mentioning one or two parties, you gotta try and remember others as well to avoid being rude, you know. But I'm pretty sure we will have a closing session where I'll be reading from the roster of the who's who. But the two that I've been mentioning now is because we've just come off a very, very exciting weekend, eventful weekend. If we show signs of fatigue, please forgive us, because not only have we worked hard over the past 2 days, we've also partied pretty hard, so to congratulate ourselves. And I think the DG has done the welcome, and that part of the reason why I sound a bit unstable or jittery is because he took the words from my mouth. And I was written a long speech, and when he started speaking, and I was like, this guy, did he jump into my computer or something like that? So I've got nothing to say now. And here's the problem, because he is the program director. He's going to be introducing the plenary panelists, and I can't, again, my thunder being stolen. So with that, I'd like to welcome everybody and wish you a very successful convention, and to use the time here to make new alliances, new friends, new contacts, and we will be around throughout the convention should you need any assistance. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Msomi. No, I didn't crash. I didn't get into your machine, but maybe we have spent too much time together. That what you have in mind and what I do have in mind in terms of trying to build this sector in South Africa and the rest of the continent, we are aligned. And I'm extremely excited to hear that the number of startups is going up. And of course, we'll go and see them during the break. And the reason for that is that as a quasi-politician, we always need evidence to convince politicians why we're putting so much money in science. So any evidence that we can see and we can demonstrate always helps us. So we would like then to move the program, and please, because of time, I'm not reading the bios of the speakers so that we can catch up with time. If you do like to know more about them, that's in the program in much more detail. I'll just say a few words. So we have a message of support from Dr. Michelle McCary-Heath, the CEO of Bio International. We had an excellent exchange of ideas this morning in relation to my impression of how lucky the US is in terms of states that have embraced this technology and how they can show in California and the state of Massachusetts the evidence of companies that have benefited from investing in biotech. So please, a round of applause for Dr. Michelle McCary-Heath.
I always have to adjust. My mother always said the best things come in small packages, so. Good morning. It is such a pleasure to join you. Thank you, DG, for the kind introduction. And it is an honor to be a part of this amazing convening. It's always a pleasure to come to South Africa and witness the growth that is taking place here. And I want to thank each of you as well in attendance for making this convention a priority, especially as we are emerging from COVID. Bio is tremendously proud of our partnership with Bioafrica and has supported this event since its inception. And we're also honored each year to host the South African delegation at our conference in the US. Bio really believes in collaboration. We think it leads to partnerships that create results. And we believe that these results improve people's lives, and it requires everyone to combine their resources and expertise to really make progress. It's what science is all about. And this moment really calls for us to aim high. Health, environmental, agriculture insecurities are growing, and COVID really highlighted what too many of us really already knew. The world needs new answers to its problems. The threat of infectious diseases is increasing, and chronic illnesses that continue to plague us are often overlooked. Food insecurity is leading to greater hunger, and climate change is a leading reason why. Many of these life-threatening and culture-threatening crises are man-made, and so we must turn to a man and woman-driven solution, and that solution is biotechnology. So you are here because you believe in the power of biotech, as I do, and you know that it's creating new cures and answers to the world's biggest problems. Perhaps you had a part in the record-breaking development of COVID vaccines or therapeutics, or maybe you're working on a new crop that's critically resistant to drought and disease. Whatever your focus, you are putting your faith in science and innovation to lead us to a better place. But you're also putting your faith in a system that supports those efforts. And it's important that that system really helps us bring these advances to more communities. Bio's mission is to strengthen that system to help scientists, investors, and company leaders deliver your products to more people in need. And it's not always easy to get this right. Finding the proper balance in life is always tricky, and in science that is no less the case. But if there's one thing that I've learned, it's that science is limitless when we limit science less. Of course, for too long, life-changing innovations have only been accessible to a privileged few, and that has got to change. But bringing hope to more people is one reason that in 2014, my colleague and the BioUSA board vice chair, Dr. Ted Love, became the CEO of a young company called Global Blood Therapeutics. And I want to tell you about Ted because his story inspires me, and I hope it will inspire many of you. So Ted is an African-American scientist who grew up poor on his family's farm in the southern part of the US without easy access to either education or healthcare. But he was determined and went on to train as a physician at Harvard's Mass General Hospital and became a leading scientist at Genentech. But he continued to be bothered by the inequities that he had witnessed in how scientists and clinicians dealt with both the patients and the diseases that primarily affect patients of color. As many of you know, genetic diseases like sickle cell can affect Black people at far greater rates than whites. And there are estimated 20 million people worldwide with sickle cell today. Many of them are here in Africa, and yet research, attention, and clinical progress has been unjustifiably slow in this area. And generations of Black people with sickle cell waited in vain for research to take up their cause. But Ted was determined to change that, and so 8 years ago, he came out of retirement to found GBT. And he told me once, sickle cell has no advocacy. It had no investment. Even if funding had been granted, there was probably less requests for it, and so the net effect was that we weren't really investing in the disease. TED and Global Blood Therapeutics have made sickle cell their priority, and in 2019, after raising well over $1 billion in research funding, GBT secured US approval for a pill called Oxbryta. Today, Oxbryta has proven to be exceptionally effective at treating sickle cell. It's one of the first new sickle cell treatments in decades. And he wants to reach more communities and more countries in need. So Global Blood Therapeutics represents a success story. And soon, that success in the US will be seen around the world. But this is a success story that has been supported by strong intellectual property protections and regulatory pathways that really helped Ted and his company overcome a historic reluctance to invest in diseases that disproportionately affect patients of color. So it's a success we have to replicate, and I have faith that everyone in this room has the power to do so. Bio fights for a strong global innovation ecosystem that can do just that, and we know that there's a thriving biotech industry here in South Africa and a growing one across the continent. And I know that you all care about health equity like Ted does, and that you believe in the power of biotechnology to change lives. After all, South Africa has been a leader when it comes to COVID detection, Groups like Afrigen and Biovac have voluntarily led the way in partnerships around the mRNA hub, and they're increasing vaccine manufacturing where it's needed. So there's so much more to do, but there are a few things that I encourage you to pursue in order to support biotech's growth and help us reach our potential. So one, seek inclusive and diverse partnerships to develop your ideas, and that's why conferences like this are so important. We need to bring entrepreneurs and policymakers and researchers together to really create the conditions for growth and success. We need partnerships between large and small companies, national and global ones, and we need to build a path towards sustainable solutions. Two, ensure efficient regulatory systems and strong intellectual property. That is really going to allow our entrepreneurs to not only be successful once, but to replicate that success in the future. And it's incredibly important that we do so. And three, don't be shy about advocating for science. As we heard from the DG, it's always important to remind our policymakers that investment in science pays off, and we need to stand up for the work that we do and the goals that we strive to attain. On the plane over, and I'll just close with this story, I was reading a profile of the historically successful and yet endlessly derided Black Formula One driver, Lewis Hamilton. Many of you are probably familiar with Lewis Hamilton. He revealed that he has the words "powerful beyond measure" tattooed across his chest. And it's to remind himself every day of the Merriam-Webster quote, "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light and not our darkness that most frightens us." And those of us who look like we do and not in the image that the world so often holds of successful scientists and entrepreneurs need to remember every day that we are powerful beyond measure. Ted's story is inspiring, but it's also inspiring to look out across this room and see the progress already accomplished. So inspiring that I brought my 10-year-old daughter here with me so that she could see this collection of amazing scientists and entrepreneurs of various ethnic backgrounds. You have amazing progress already accomplished, potential yet to come, and the promise for how your collective work will change the globe. The progress is evident in how scientists from this continent have led the world in detecting and responding to COVID variants, how South Africa has challenged the paradigms in building the world's first mRNA hub, and in the incisive arguments leaders from Africa have provided in the global distribution of COVID vaccines. But the recent pandemic, as you know, was not the beginning and will not be the end of the transformative power of African scientists and entrepreneurs on the world. The potential is also evident in the 600 students who are expected at this year's conference. I met members of the delegation from Emory University last night, and they remarked on the high level of questions and insights they heard at their weekend workshop for up-and-coming biotech leaders. Like Black and female scientists around the globe, African scientists are too often met with doubt or derision, or both. But those of us who had partnered with African scientists over the years know the world should expect nothing less than greatness. It may be greatness that challenges Western concepts, approaches, or assumptions, but it is greatness nonetheless. And the promise is that Black scientists around the world are looking to you to change the face of science and to change the types of questions that science as a whole asks. We need you to help us prioritize and make sure we achieve the answers that really will make a difference to communities around the world. I have a book coming out in the fall called Just Science, and it's about the role of science in social justice and how global equity and widespread prosperity in health really requires scientific breakthroughs to achieve. So whether you're talking about sustainable and affordable crops, the clean air that our children need to breathe, curbing the dangers of global warming, or cutting or preventing diseases, biotechnology holds the key to solve all of these challenges. And diverse scientists from around the world are depending upon the critical mass of diverse scientific greatness found in Africa to prove that we need diverse minds at the table to keep our eyes trained on those very critical questions. Science depends on creativity, and creativity is defined by new and diverse perspectives. So if, working together, we don't ensure that your voices are reflected in the global scientific debates and decisions, biotechnology will not move fast enough or bold enough, and certainly will not be powerful enough to meet the challenges we face today, and most certainly those of tomorrow. So the world may not expect you. I know the world didn't expect me. And the world will depend upon you. And I deeply believe that you will change the face, the path, and the impact of science on the world. So thank you so much for the opportunity for BioUSA to partner with you in this amazing gathering. And thank you for the kind and honoring invitation to speak to you this morning. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Michelle. So I'm inspired by a couple of things that you've said. The first one is that we need new solutions to the problems that we're having in the world. And I'm also inspired about the fact that science is important, but also science to address inequities, including the story of Ted. I think it's an inspiring story for all of us. And then the issue of local ecosystem and diversity in partnership is extremely important. So we keep taking these messages in our own journey in South Africa and the rest of the continent. And we don't really take your being here for granted, especially the point you made at the beginning. One of my colleagues, Dr. Rebecca Maseremula, who's an acting DG in one of the portfolios, spoke very, very, very passionately and how impressed she was when she went to San Diego this year. I apologize, I haven't had a chance to go there, but maybe I'm even more inspired with what I've heard and what you do to come there in the next meeting. Thank you very much for your message. We now will take the message from the mayor's office. I assume, Dr. Msomi, we are sorted. We have somebody from there? If not, we will proceed. I can't see anybody waving.
There's the mayor, the new mayor.
All right, I suggest that in the interest of time, I know these opening sessions, if they are late, then the rest of the program can really be derailed. So we now have two keynote speakers, Dr. Dennis Leota and Dr. George Painter. They are from Emory University. Maybe they don't know how South Africa and the relationship we have with you, how important it is. I know that we've been doing lots and lots of things with yourselves, and we appreciate you being here and look forward to your keynote speak. Are you ready to come forward? Round of applause then for Dennis and George. So will you just come on the screen? Okay, so excellent.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. George and I have been coming to South Africa for many years. It's like our second home, so it's great to be home again. And thanks, Dr. Msomi, for the opportunity to do this. George.
So we team teach, okay? So really, the consensus in the medical community, or a growing consensus by late 70s, 79, was that we were getting the upper hand on microbes, on infectious disease. But of course, in 1981, with the emergence of the devastating HIV pandemic, which is ongoing, and then in the ensuing years, as climate change, more increasing local epidemics of high impact, and of course, we've all just lived through, or living through, the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. So Dennis and I's career bookend both of these pandemics. So we thought that by relating our experience and passing on our experience, it might help facilitate a response to the next one.
So I don't have to tell this audience about the ravages to every aspect of our lives that were caused by the HIV pandemic and in fact continue to be caused by HIV. You all know the stats, and it's been a devastating problem. And we got involved in this fairly early on. George was a scientist at what was then Burroughs Wellcome Corporation in the US, and I was at Emory, and we formed one of those early partnerships between a university and an academic and a commercial entity, and it proved pretty fruitful. So I thought we could go through some of the lessons that we learned because I think they're applicable to future pandemics. In this particular case, when HIV was identified as the etiological cause of HIV, we looked for targets that were unique to the virus. And of course, the aficionados know this, but we do that to minimize toxicity. If we can find a viral target that's sufficiently different from a human target, then of course that gives us an advantage. And the target that was most popular in the early stages was the HIV reverse transcriptase, an enzyme that before we started, a few successful drugs had been made but the problems with these drugs were that they didn't sufficiently differentiate themselves from human targets, which meant that they had a lot of toxicities. So we were looking for something that had a better profile. And again, for those who don't understand how this process works, a growing strand of DNA interacts with a nucleoside triphosphate, and we form basically a new phosphodiester linkage. And this process can be terminated if this group is not a hydroxyl group. So as a newcomer, I was very attracted to that mechanism because it was simple, and I figured we could find many compounds that would fit that criteria. Of course, so did others, and as you might suspect, the problem wasn't that simple. These materials turn out to be very highly charged, which makes them poorly permeable through many of the barriers that the drug has to go to reach its target. So we end up giving not the active species, but the actual nucleoside, which can passively diffuse, and once it gets into the cell, the cytosol, it can then, if you designed it properly, be a good substrate for cellular kinases, go to the triphosphate stage, be incorporated, and in the best case scenario, selectively inhibit the viral reverse transcriptase without touching the human HIV polymerases. That's the hypothesis, and it took a long time to figure out how to do that effectively. However, through this partnership that George and I had, we found a drug which turned out to be pretty wonderful. The profile here I put up for the aficionados. I'm not going to go through it, but it was much better, much cleaner, much safer than any drug that existed at the time. And so we were in I was in a state of near euphoria until George called me one day and said, We used to call it FTC during the development. And he said, Dennis, FTC is dead. And I said, what do you mean it's dead? It has a fabulous profile. And he said, the problem is resistance. And one of the problems we find in developing antiviral agents is when you give them as monotherapies, many times they will develop or allow for the development of resistant mutants that the drug is no longer effective for. And so the issue then becomes, oh man, do we have to make multiple drugs just to solve this resistance problem? Can we do it with one drug alone? And the answer, by and large, up until recently, has been no. But there have been some advances in there. But just to go through this issue of resistance, I thought we could show it quickly and give you an idea of what we had to face in dealing with it. So the virus doesn't have any proof-checking enzymes, and so it will mutate. It will form an error about 1 in every 10,000 replications, and there are about 1 trillion replications per day. So you can see that in a very short time, you'll develop a whole series of mutant strains of the enzyme, of the particular virus. And when we add a drug, the drug is almost always able to suppress many of those mutants, but not all of them. And so the ones it can suppress go down in their levels, but the ones it can't suppress rise up and then mutate on their own. So we have this constant problem of dealing with this situation. The answer to that became combination therapy. And combination therapy took a long time to emerge. But in particular, the drug we discovered, M-tricytidine, when used in combination with 2 other drugs, turned out to be quite an interesting game changer. M-tricytidine is actually useful in many different combinations, and let me just go. And this is, there are about 18 different FDA-approved combination therapies that involve M-tricytidine or its related compound lamivudine that were discovered in my lab. And these have proven to be really important and useful. And just to show the impact of these, in the middle 1990s, when we had the first use of combination therapy, patients had to take 15 to 20 pills a day. And you can imagine this is a compliance nightmare. And with the onset of ATRIPLA in 2006, we had 1 pill once a day, and our Office of Technology Transfer estimates that over 90% of people who have taken HIV therapies use one of the drugs that was invented in our lab. So this was an important achievement, but notice ATRIPLA was approved in around 2006, and George mentioned the HIV was discovered in 1981. That's a 25-year period. Obviously, for pandemics, we can't afford that kind of timeline. So, so we had to find a way of accelerating the process. And we started something we call DRIVE, which stands for Drug Innovation Ventures at Emory. And academia is a wonderful place for doing discovery, but when it comes to development, it's pretty poorly suited to move things along. So after many conversations with George, we had this idea, let's bring in some people from the commercial sector who know about drug development, and let's find some ways of trying to circumvent the unintended impediments that exist within the university setting for moving things along. And to that end, we created DRIVE, and I'm going to let George describe DRIVE to you, the concept briefly, and then let him explain how this was the foundation for the great work that he did in developing molnupiravir, one of the drugs approved to treat COVID-19.
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. So the idea behind DRIVE was to bring drug developers proximal to innovators so that we could make this sort of seamless interaction to increase the time and capital efficiency of moving drugs quickly. So after the discussion with Dennis, I agreed to come back to Emory after 30 years with my cultural anthropologist, because the commercial sector is very different from the academic sector, and I think one of the big victories here has been how we've been able to integrate this together into an effective unit. There already was what was called, at that time, the Emory Institute of Drug Discovery, started by Dennis. We modified the name to development. So in essence, DRIVE represents a group of people that are skilled in the development and commercialization of drugs, but when married to the Emory Institute of Drug Development, functions the equivalent of a biotechnology company operating inside of a very well-funded and intellectually prominent major research university. So we all know you need capital. And as we contemplated how to move DRIVE forward, how do you finance something inside of a university, two key pieces of legislation in the United States. In 2004, the BioShield Act, which was meant to fund the development of medical countermeasures, really for weapons of mass destruction. And then in 2006, the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act, which really was focused on influenza, but the remit was broadened in 2011 in the Obama administration to include emerging infectious disease. So by the time we rolled out DRIVE in 2012, we knew that if we were effective in doing what was called translational science, which means taking a discovery, translating it into a product, that the funding, when combined what was already available with the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, we could fund the effort. So,
worldwide disease burden.
Yeah, so about 2010, I started getting interested in single-stranded RNA viruses. So at any given time, 80% of the world's disease burden is due to single-stranded DNA viruses. And RNA viruses, pardon me. And when you think of things like influenza, rhinovirus, all of these things, respiratory viruses, they're RNA viruses. Others that you know well, Ebola, Marburg, things like these. So it's high disease impact. Also SARS and MERS. Remember those, the first beta coronaviruses that appeared in the population. So that was our focus. With the funding and a focus on single-stranded RNA viruses, we began to set the stage for operations inside of DRIVE EIDD. So, as a consequence, as you'll see, when SARS-CoV-2 was identified as the etiologic agent of these pneumonias of unknown origin in China in late 2019, early 2020, we were perfectly positioned to move. But look, when you start talking about a countermeasure, a therapeutic agent to use in a public health emergency, there's something called a target product profile that you need to fit in order to make it highly effective. Honestly, one of the biggest ones is that it's orally available and self-administratable, right? So if something really bad happens, there's some way to distribute to people to self-administer an effective medical countermeasure. It can't be really squirrely and can I eat breakfast and take it, or do I have to eat avocados? You know, strange dietary requirements or anything that might impact the bioavailability, how much drug gets on board after you take it. And one thing that I find interesting that we've worked on for many years but gets overlooked, the drug has to go to where the disease is. That's called appropriate tissue distribution. So you have to start looking at where the drug goes to intercept the pathogenesis of the disease under consideration. Low risk of drug-drug interactions. I don't know if you've looked at Paxlovid. It's highly limited in people that are medically managed. So you want something that doesn't have what are called DDIs, drug-drug interactions. And as Dennis pointed out, one of the key issues is resistance. If you start distributing a drug in a pandemic and it goes one circulation and then a mutant emerges under drug pressure that's resistant, well, game, set, match for the countermeasure. And there are currently 204 single-stranded RNA viruses that have been identified as human pathogens that can cause disease. There's not enough money, time, or people to develop one drug for every potential virus that can emerge and that has pandemic potential. So you look for broad spectrum. Broad spectrum is activity against many viruses. I have a joke about that, and I'll tell it because in the United States, if you look at high occupancy car lanes, you can get in them if you have 2 people. That's not the same in the rest of the world. The minimum definition of a broad spectrum antiviral funding by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease is 2 viruses. But something very special happened with these RNA viruses that Dennis and I didn't see with DNA. The nucleoside analogs that target the virally encoded polymerase, the enzyme responsible for making the genome, they tend to be very broadly active. That's fortuitous, it wasn't foreseen, but it's going to help us. So speaking of targeting, we were looking for a broad spectrum drug. How do you get it where it needs to go? So we started looking at host carriers. These are sodium-dependent active transporters. I won't go through the whole rigmarole, but if you look in, let's see if I know how to do this, cytidine. We started looking at pyrimidines, pyrimidine nucleosides that could be seen as substrates by the virally encoded polymerase, and when incorporated into growing RNA, could terminate or interrupt the flow of genetic material and thereby stop viral replication. So we started down that path of looking at cytidine analogs. And of course, we had a great advantage. We had one of the world's best nucleoside chemists right next door. So a lot of the people had been trained by Dennis. I had worked starting with AZT, so we knew how, or we think, we know how to do this. So we started looking at cytidine analogs. That quickly led to the identification of what's shown on the left and identified as EIDD 1931. That's an internal code, and that compound was active against a very broad spectrum of viruses. And when you go back and you look at this, what we tried to do is say, are these phylogenetically related? Are these close relatives? And the answer was no. That somehow they're active across this broad family of viruses. And that's a subject of research that we have to do. It probably involves more than the virally encoded polymerase, but what's called the replicase, which is not only virally encoded proteins, but host proteins. Remember, viruses are defined as obligate intracellular parasites. So as Dennis pointed out, it's very difficult to touch the virus and not touch the host. And that's one of the keys. How do you get that selectivity? So in this compound, we found that selectivity. Resistance. This compound, let me go back to it in a minute. If you look up here, this is actually cytidine, but with a hydroxyl group on the N4 amino. So this can, what's called tautomerize, and this proton migrate, double bond here, double bond, single bond there, double bond there. So you go from looking like cytidine, which has a hydrogen bond, into the host DNA, RNA that's used as the template, to a lone pair of electrons, and it starts looking like uridine. So if it tautomerizes, it shifts between looking like uridine and cytidine. And that can be utilized in something called error catastrophe. Just quickly, so think of it this way. So here on the left, you're looking at what looks like uridine, and it bonds to A, the other canonical base. But if it tautomerizes and goes back and looks like C, then it pairs with G. So in first strand synthesis, when you start to make the new genome, it gets incorporated looking like U, tautomerizes and looks like C. So when the next strand's made, it introduces what are called transition mutations. And these viruses live on the edge of biological viability because they do not have, in general, now coronaviruses have some error reading, but not a lot. So you start introducing a few mutations and the virus's viability and virulence collapses quickly. And theoretically, there's no way to get resistance to this for a number of reasons. And by the way, this idea of this kind of mechanism didn't come from virologists. It came from Manfred Eigen, a physical chemist. Quite interesting. At any rate, that's where we started. Broad spectrum, get around, use viral error catastrophe to get around resistance. Then the issue of how do you get it on board? So we put this drug very quickly into a number of species. High bioavailability till we tested in non-human primates, collapsed to nothing. So the gist of this, without going into, these are the villi in your stomach, you swallow in your duodenum, you swallow the drug, and it's got to cross that biological barrier to get into the circulating volume of your plasma, and then be distributed to where it needs to go. The case of coronavirus, that's a vascular disease. Of course, it has pulmonary manifestations, but it's got to be broadly, and we felt it had to get into the CNS because of neurological issues. So we simply had to make a prodrug, as Dennis pointed out. So we covered up the end here where there's a free hydroxyl and facilitated entry into the circulating volume. That's cleaved off. It's distributed by those uptake transporters, the sodium-dependent active transporters, quickly into tissue. And let me emphasize that. I worked on AZT, my first drug. When you swallow that drug to the time where it's activated by the mechanism Dennis showed, is 36 hours. If you have a drug, if you have a virus that gets in your brain and causes meningoencephalitis in 18 hours, well, you're out of luck, right? Not only does it have to get on board, but get to the site of action quickly. And so this thing was set up to do that. So phase 1, so let me just say, we were moving into influenza late in 2019. In 2020, I was at the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference in San Francisco. We knew the compound was active against SARS and MERS. The government called, the FDA BARDA, which is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, and the NIAID, and said, hey, you guys going to do this? And we said, of course. So then at that meeting, we realized, and this is one of the things built into Drive, Drive has the ability to interact quickly with the biotechnology sector so that you can move assets out to an advanced developer out of the university quickly. So sitting in the hallway of one of the meeting hotels, because we couldn't get a conference room, we made a deal with a group called Ridgeback Bio. And Ridgeback Bio had been active in Africa in the DRC because they had developed one of the approved Ebola antibodies. So we liked these people, we were on the same wavelength, and they said, guess what? Tomorrow we can have $300 million in capital to move this quickly. So we got through phase one. I don't want to go into a lot of that, just to tell you that this drug went on board people in a very metered fashion. And so in the first dose in what's called a phase one safety or tolerability and pharmacokinetics, if the patient or volunteer took 100 mg dose, then when they took a 400 mg dose, it was 4 times the 100 mg dose in terms of exposure. It was totally dose dependent. There were no side effects, there were no issues. So we were ready to go. So at that point, it's global. The biotech company put capital on the line. We worked quickly with regulators first in the UK, and they were on the air 24/7, and were actually looking at getting the drug into emergency use in a fashion where they didn't demand that the company write a gigantic document that takes months and then take another 3 months to look at it. As the data came out, they reviewed it, and all that data was put back into a format acceptable to the US FDA. So it quickly got emergency use authorization in the UK and then in the United States. This is actually from Merck. They became our partner, and I think that whole idea of how quickly it went from us, the academic guys, and early stage drug developers, to biotech, to major pharma, who took it into phase 3. And the phase 3s were run in 108 countries around the world. And there's a growing body of evidence that shows it works. A lot of evidence that shows it works. 2 big publications last week in The Lancet. And there have been a lot of safety issues answered, so the drug's effective. I think one of the lessons going away,
Just skip that one.
skip that one. That's the one that has all the numbers in it that are confusing. I think one of the lessons in going away is one of the focuses of Dr. Msomi's work. This isn't a static situation. There's a microbe speaking about emergence of mutants. So the target's not the same. As you progress through the pandemic, the target virus is changing, okay? The disease itself is polyphenotypic in its clinical presentation. Some people had neurologic issues, other people through clots, other people were short of breath. So what are the clinical endpoints that you need to look at? And they changed with the virus. And of course, they change with the geography. People respond differently. People have different thresholds before they're off to hospital or before they declare themselves sick. So I think as we move forward, that one of the big issues is going to be, how do you run clinical trials in a pandemic? And I think that's really an issue that the worldwide community working together needs to answer.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think South Africa is ideally suited. It has an excellent medical infrastructure, and it really ought to be a major site of clinical trials for new drugs. I think with a little investment in infrastructure, this could be one of the go-to places where we evaluate drugs in an emergency situation. And you have great diversity in patient population. Many of your patients are drug naive, all sorts of different diversity. So DG, this is the place to invest in that initiative. I think we probably have run through our time, and this idea of our careers being bookended by these pandemics and our continuing evolution, just like the viruses evolve, we've evolved to try to develop a more nimble framework for going forward. And we're happy, if anyone's interested, to share some more specifics about that with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much to Dennis and George. One thing you should know about me is that I was asked as part of the curriculum, Dennis and George, to do Chemistry 1. The smell in the lab made a choice for me that I wasn't going to continue with Chemistry 2. So what that means is that I probably understood half of what you've said, but because of that, I've got some conclusions and some observations. I think we've made time, so if you don't mind, I'm happy to allow maybe 2 questions of clarity from the floor, if you don't mind, and then I've got a couple of observations. So any observations, anything that impressed you and you'd like us here in the front? I think there's a hand. It's dark from here where you are, but yes, there is a microphone, I'm sure, that we can bring to you. And then any other person? Where? Yeah, okay, so let's take those 2 for now. Have you got the mic? Not yet? Is it possible? Otherwise we can, okay, there are 2 mics. There's a lady in, I'm scared to say what color she's in, otherwise the dinner today will be talking about how colorblind I am. So yeah, okay. Over to you, ma'am.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity to interact, and thank you to Dr. Lyoto and Dr. Painter on that cognate and insightful presentation. So I'm really interested in what you've presented on drug resistance, especially as you've related it to HIV, which we know plagues our country and Africa as a whole a lot. So there's a rise in antimicrobial resistance in our country, South Africa, and in Africa as well. And I've listened to the strategies that you've talked about in terms of, seeing HIV resistance in some of the drug treatments that you've developed, and what strategies and mechanisms you've used in trying to solve those problems. And so my point of discussion, or my question to you, would be, as a country, and knowing what kind of resources and capabilities we might have, what are the strategies and mechanisms that we may use to try and get ahead of the antimicrobial resistance that we see coming up in our communities? Because I know that in a community such as ours that's plagued by infectious diseases and viral infections, if we leave it for too long for it to enjoy its presence in our communities, it really could be the next pandemic that we are faced with. So just a bit of discussion, some pointers, anything that you can share as to what are the kind of strategies that we may use to really try and get ahead of that. Thank you.
You didn't tell us who you are.
Sorry, my name is Dr. Batabile Ramalapa from the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in Pretoria, South Africa.
CSIR, thank you very much. So we had a second hand, yes. Oh, okay, super.
Thank you. My name is Tebo Khotlopane from Biomuti. I'm also one of the speakers. We'll be talking about cannabis tomorrow. Thank you from the doctors. It was quite inciting to hear exactly how it came about with Mona Paraver. And we are also part of a group in South Africa that received from the generic side the ability to be able to get the medicine into hospitals. So my question is two-part loaded. One is that with the aspect of being able to, or identifying South Africa as a potential place, to run some of these clinical trials, would it then be a possibility where we are given at least the ability and opportunity to actually manufacture these drugs here at home? Because part of the issues that we've discovered is that COVID has shown most of developing countries a lot of flames because we don't have the core competencies of actually making these drugs here at home. We importing 99% of our drugs, and I think that's not a sustainable thing going forward, and I'm sure everybody agrees. So some of the opportunities that I think in line with the ability for us to partner up, so if we're going to be the place where clinical trials will be conducted, ideally it could be the place where these drugs would be then manufactured, especially for the African market. Is that possibility going forward? So that we are, as countries, are able to, be able to stand by our own 2 feet going forward. But I think that core competence will be quite ideal for us to do so. Second part is that the pandemic is still there, but globally everybody is quite laxed. I was listening to news the other day that 1 million people have died, as of yesterday. So the question, and being in an environment where we know that we've got Mona Paraver in the country, and nobody's actually placing orders because there is no agency, there is no need to, or at least looks as if there's no need to. How do we then encourage that to happen? Because as you can see, there isn't any emergency anymore than there was a year or two ago. So those are the questions that I had. Thank you.
Okay, no, thanks very much. So may I invite you to respond? I think the mics there should be.
Yeah. So we'll try. I'll let George take the stab at the first question, and then we'll try to address the second question together.
Look, what I find interesting about the questions, the same questions that we face back home. The issue of antimicrobial resistance is an enormous problem. And it probably stands to impact us as much as anything, if not more. And there's no clear answer yet. What happened in the United States, starting about 6 years ago, was antimicrobial stewardship. Because I remember when I was younger, very younger, my kids, any ailment, sorry, it won't come out. Ailment was pediatrician, if you had a fever, you got an antibiotic. And of course, that's wrong. The introduction of antibiotics into animals, I was quite taken aback to hear that, for example, in Colombia, South America, that animals getting antimicrobials, of course, a lot of it comes out in feces and is in the stockyards in the heat, and there are earthquakes, so they're like par shakers at temperature, and streptomycin-resistant bacteria have been isolated. So I think at present, the answer is stewardship, appropriate use, protocols in place to not overuse the antibiotics. And then there's a business issue. In the United States, the discovery of a broadly active antimicrobial against resistant strains is put on the shelf. So when you go back to look for money to fund biotechs to find these new antibiotics, there's not a lot of what's called total accessible market. So there's no financial incentive for investment. The United States government has just instituted a program to try to finance that. So there's no clear answer, but antibiotic stewardship is in place in the United States in all major health institutions.
The second question, there are multiple answers in terms of how you get drug here. One, I think, that I like to remind people was innovated decades ago by Gilead Sciences. They had an access program, and they would grant manufacturing facilities around the world a license, give them a very modest royalty, and allow them to produce the drug that could then be distributed everywhere. And many other pharmaceutical companies have taken up that model. So it's a way of getting life-saving drugs to the people who need them. There's a better way, and we have the DG here, so I'll just take the liberty of saying that for the last 20 years, I think South Africa could have and should have developed its own pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity. I think it's a matter of national security to have that kind of capacity. It's a large investment, but if you find a partner, and we know a lot of people who do that manufacturing, and we had one group who had looked all around the world and had thought that South Africa might be one of the most viable places to build such a facility. It's something that is needed here, and I would say there's economic benefit because you can go from this importer mode to something where if you had the capacity, you can actually start exporting drugs to others that need them, and that would be fantastic. So a little political commentary there.
Don't answer yet. Let me jump in too, because I've worked with the U.S. government on this. It is a matter of national security. And you want to hear something ironic? The United States imports most of their drugs. So if you go back to 2009 to H1N1, there was a shortage of oseltamivir, and most of it came from India. The availability of molnupiravir now to South Africa is by way of Dr. Reddy in India. So India decided they needed to put their own population first. You can't fault them for this. So there was a shortage of oseltamivir. So Dennis is right. But behind that, there's another issue. So, okay, you have the finishing plant to make the active pharmaceutical ingredient. Do you have all of the facilities to make the chemicals behind that? And that's the trouble in the United States right now. Big political movement, oh, we're going to bring it home, but then you have to bring home the fine chemical industry to back it up. But I think you guys, I mean, you're at the crossroads of the world, you know, and maybe even have some better relationships with people that supply those fine chemicals than currently the United States does.
Okay, now thanks very much. I don't know, Dr. Msomi, if I should respond to this issue of where are we in our thinking around the local production capability, the second question. All I can say at this meeting is that next year we'll make the announcement. We've done all the work Africa Bio is working with the department to look at the capacities we have in the downstream side of things, in the private sector companies, not only for COVID vaccines, but the vaccines that we buy in South Africa. We have a list of them and we know how much money we're paying. It's not a small amount of money. We have analyzed the middle part of the innovation chain in terms of clinical trial capabilities that you talked about, Dennis, at the end, and we will take the offer of how we can work with you, because also if you have inbound technologies into the country, that clinical platform is important, because that's where you test and that's where you learn and go to what we call the discovery science. And we've mapped out all the institutions that we can pull together to make sure that we move back in the innovation chain, so that we not just import and produce under license, but we also draw on the scientific capability that you talked about earlier on, and begin to make sure that we play significantly on the upstream and the discovery side of things. So we will then make an appropriate announcement. Of course, there are tricks or there are challenges in this game, and in particular, how do you make sure that when you produce, you have a buyer? So with CDC and the rest of the continent, we're just trying to understand how we make sure that you don't end up with an excellent product, but there's somebody who's ready and willing to buy the product. So we will be. But I just want to make a couple of comments on what you've shared with us. The fact that you've lived between the two pandemics and the lessons that you've shared with us are greatly appreciated, but also reminding us that when you make investments in science, you may not have immediate discoveries, but further down the line, we will draw on those investments in order to respond to those. So I think it's an excellent story and a good, if you like, take-home message for us. Dealing with drug resistance and how you've approached that during the early days of HIV drugs. I really like the DRIVE model, and those of South Africans who are here do know how we're battling with this in South Africa. So the lessons on the DRIVE model, and I always say, I think somebody says that the first lesson of being wise is to know what you don't know. So the fact that you're saying that, and please my academic friends, no offense, but that if you really want to take things to market, work with the private sector and the innovators as quickly as possible. So I think that's a lesson that I think I will be taking out of this. And then congratulate you on the FDA authorizing the oral antiviral for treatment of COVID-19 for certain patients. And I suspect, having heard in South Africa why the majority of South Africans, and men in particular, didn't take the vaccine, it's because of something fairly sharp that you use to get the vaccine onto. So the oral vaccine, South Africa, and that's great news. And then I think this offer of clinical trials and the population diversity, we take that seriously, and we will make sure that we respond appropriately to that. So we now would like to request Dr. Ahmed Omar, if you are ready, who is the Africa CDC Director, to come and share what's happening in the continent. So a round of applause for him. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, DG. Let me break protocol a bit. Dr. Msomi, I will not ask you forgive me. DG, forgive me. Him usually is... Let's give ourselves a round of applause. The scientists, whether they are students, they are startups, they are mentors, they are experts. We do a lot of work. Many times all the sweat is not recognized, well, unless a drug comes up. But there's a lot that is happening underneath that forms the base for all those drugs that we get to know, all the products that we get to know. So let's just give ourselves a round of applause for doing good work. And after the applause, let me remind you that the COVID pandemic is still here. 20% vaccination rate on this continent is still way, way below where we need to be. And I hope everyone is vaccinated here. And if they are not, then we can make arrangements for everyone to get a jab who needs it, because it saves lives. So DG, and please, through you, pass my warmest of greetings to the Minister. Looking forward to the intervention tomorrow. Colleagues from all other ministries that are represented here. The representative of the Mayor of Durban, lovely city. Chairperson of Bioafrica, you, your team as well. Our speakers, Michelle, Dennis, George. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me really great pleasure to bring very warm greetings from Africa CDC and the Africa Union. And also, it's really an honor and my pleasure to be here with you during this 5th Bioafrica Convention. I think I'm told it's the first one in person since the pandemic, so it's special in its own way. The reality is that when Africa comes together, a lot of good things happen. And we are coming together here in Durban, and I'm looking forward to a lot of good things happening over this few days of the 5th Bioafrica Convention. The theme for this year is very befitting of our times, and that is Africa Resilient. I like that, Africa Resilient. And you and I have a part to play, we have a role to play to truly make Africa resilient. We need to use our ideas, our passion, and commitment to make sure that this continent, and by extension the whole world, is a better place, a safer place, more secure, and for us in Africa, more self-reliant. That resilience can only come from our individual action, and we put it together, we all benefit. Ladies and gentlemen, the pandemic, as well as the many disease threats and health emergencies that we have been responding to on this continent over the past so many years, has taught us, as Africa CDC and by extension the whole continent, because we do the work of coordination on the continent, of many, many health emergencies, dozens of them in a year. Those that make the news are very few, but we do a lot in the background to try and control disease outbreaks, to try and control health emergencies. And all these have taught us some lessons, some very painful. And I would like to share with you 2 lessons here today. The first is, when a crisis is big, like the pandemic, Africa is on its own. And for those of you who are here on the continent, I am sure you know what I mean. When the crisis is big, Africa is on its own. This is a painful lesson that we learned. And we thought it was over until we looked at when a crisis is smaller and more local. We also realized that we were learning another lesson. So long as it was smaller, it was local, it was not a global priority, Africa is on its own. These lessons teach us that if we don't find a way of working together as Africa, and when I say Africa, I don't mean only those of us who are African, it's also those who have the interests of this continent at heart. If we don't find a way of coming together and working together, then we will continue to be an Africa on its own. I think that time has passed. We have enough lessons that we must be able to put into use so that Africa will no longer be on its own. And even if we are, we'll have enough to be able to protect ourselves, to prepare better, to respond faster, and to secure this continent. The beauty of being on your own, as the saying goes, is that necessity then becomes the mother of invention. Let us make this 5th Africa Bio Convention the mother of inventions that Africa urgently needs and richly deserves. Let's spend the time making sure that we are handling our knowledge, our experience, our networking in a way that is going to benefit this continent. After all, it is a Bioafrica convention. The discussions and outcomes of this convention should, I really hope, should be well aligned with Africa's vision as a continent, with Africa's flagship initiatives. One key African vision is Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. This is a vision that has been passed by our heads of states here in Africa through the Africa Union as a mechanism, and it is the blueprint for this continent's master plan of transforming Africa into a global powerhouse. We can, because the ingredients are there. It lays out Africa's strategic framework for sustainable development, and Agenda 2063 is a manifestation of our continent's Pan-African drive for unity, for self-determination, for freedom, for progress and collective prosperity. It is a true African renaissance, and every aspect of that vision of Agenda 2063 requires innovation and local production. Ladies and gentlemen, these same lessons that we've learned during the pandemic and other health emergencies have also convinced us at Africa CDC that we must initiate change. We must initiate change. We can't wait for others to initiate it for us. That change should be initiated in a way that ensures that when we are planning and handling disease threats on the continent, it actually makes a difference here on the continent. And our vision has been captured in what we call Africa's new public health order. This new public health order has 5 pillars. The first is the need to strengthen African institutions at the continental level, at the regional level, and at the national level. Any institution that is going to be addressing public health on the continent needs to be strengthened. That means Africa CDC, the Africa Medicines Agency, Africa Bio, all those institutions that actually address public health here on the continent need to be strengthened. The second pillar is the need to strengthen our workforce. Any workforce that addresses public health, from innovators like yourselves to those disease intelligence officers that are very busy seeking out the next outbreak, to those responders who are the frontline workers who address issues around health emergencies, to those of us who sit back in the offices and do the coordination. Every health workforce, every workforce that contributes to public health needs to be strengthened. We must identify the right cadres, train them appropriately, give them the right tools, and then deploy them to the right places. When you have experts only sitting in Pretoria, Durban, Cape Town and Johannesburg, I'm sorry. Next time I'll not mention Cape Town, I'll stick to Durban. But when we are all in the cities, and yet the outbreaks are happening in the periphery of the human-animal, human-environment conflict, then we're in the wrong place. So after training these experts and giving them the right tools, we need to deploy them in the right places. We must strengthen our health workforce, and that's the second pillar of Africa's new public health order. The third is part of what we are discussing today. Expanding local production of all health products that we use in health emergencies and healthcare in general. I mean, that you can extend to everything that we need on the continent. And local production means we need to own the process from the beginning to the end. Today, if we don't secure our own local production of simple things like masks, to very complex ones like what George and Dennis have been describing here in terms of therapeutics and vaccines, then we'll still be on our own when the next pandemic comes. So local production is extremely, extremely important. And that is the third pillar of Africa's new public health order. The fourth is the very urgent need to increase domestic resources. And I don't mean only money. It's important, but domestic resources from experts like yourselves. During this pandemic, we made some very disturbing discoveries that when we were looking at the whole area of vaccines manufacture, we found out that of the many Africans that are involved in discovery of different types of molecules, the vast majority of them are actually working outside of the continent. And yet they are experts that we need here on the continent. It's a resource, and it's our resource. So we need to expand domestic resources from actual experts to the infrastructure we need, to the money, and we all need to involve ourselves in this discourse, whether we are in public sector, whether we are in private sector, whether we are in academia, in research, whether we are walking the streets of Africa. We need to be part of that resource that must be brought to the table to ensure that Africa can be able to prepare better and respond faster to the next disease threat, the next outbreak, the next pandemic. And we must involve everybody in the process. Everybody needs to be part of domestic resourcing, and they bring their expertise or their deep pocket, whichever it is that applies. The fifth and final pillar is, as President Kagame said a few months ago, the pandemic has taught us that we need to do things ourselves. But it doesn't mean that we need to do it alone. We need partners, we need friends who are going to walk with us on this path of implementing Africa's new public health order. So action-oriented and respectful partnerships is the fifth pillar. Action-oriented because we need every partnership to deliver something for the continent. We shouldn't be having partnerships where it's one-sided and the continent continues to lose, whether it is minerals, whether it is oil and gas, or the beautiful wood that we have in our forests. Whatever partnership we go into, Africa must gain. So it must be action-oriented. But very importantly, these partnerships must also be respectful of Africa's priorities. So any partnership we go into needs to be based on our priorities and needs to deliver outcomes that are directly positive for the continent's needs. Each one of these 5 pillars needs innovation. Innovation, innovation. We must innovate so that we are not using tools that are obsolete, we are not using tools that are inefficient, but we are using tools that are contemporary for our context here on the continent of Africa. So I invite you as innovators to be part of Africa's new public health order. The Africa Union, acting through the Africa CDC in April last year, launched the Partnership for African Vaccines Manufacturing. Our ambition is to change the current status quo where Africa imports 99% of the human vaccines that we use on the continent. 99% is a figure that really should not be for a continent of 1.3 billion people. We only manufacture 1% of the human vaccines. So today, Africa does not hold any intellectual property rights for the human vaccines that we use on the continent. Yet, those disease conditions and those populations that need those vaccines are here on the continent. And we too, as innovators, are right here on the continent as well. We are fully dependent on imports for human vaccines, and this, I fully agree with Dennis and George, is not only a health security challenge, it is a continental, it is a national security issue that we need to address with speed and with expertise. Every aspect of development of vaccines will need innovation. Why? Because things are changing, platforms are changing, diseases are changing. We are changing as human beings. So we need to innovate so that whatever it is that we're going to be using in terms of vaccines are the most appropriate for the continent at this time. So we've set ourselves the target that by 2040, Africa will be manufacturing 60% of its human vaccines needs, from 1% to 60% by 2040. And it is possible to do with the analysis that we have done if we all work together. Therefore, I would like to invite you to join Africa CDC and the Africa Union as we make this vision and ambition a reality. Let's innovate, manufacture, and secure the market that is Africa, 1.5 billion in a few years, so that our industries can be able to thrive and deliver Agenda 2063 for this continent. In concluding, I would like to recall one of the more famous quotes of Nelson Mandela, that it always seems impossible until it is done. You and I have the opportunity here in Durban and after we leave to renew our commitment to that wisdom from Nelson Mandela. You and I have a duty to this continent. Whether you come from the continent or not, you and I have a duty to the continent, because when Africa does it well, then the rest of the world will benefit by extension. And that duty, let's take what seems impossible and then make it happen. And we'll be living the vision and the wisdom of President Nelson Mandela. Let's innovate and make Africa's new public health order the new normal. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thanks very much to the Africa CDC Director, Dr. Ahmed Omar. This was our last speaker for this session, so just a few observations reminding us of what happens in Africa when these challenges become global, and we're the last ones on the queue, and this is fresh in our minds, so we totally agree with you, but that every dark cloud should have a silver lining, and that we should respond to this and learn from it. And I'm excited about this new public health order that you've just shared with us, with its 5 pillars. And in particular, the 5th one that says we need partners and friends, which is, I think, in line with today's meeting, that we do have friends, and they have made the offers. We are aware of the mRNA hub in Cape Town and what the intention is as part of responding to what you're asking us to do, and therefore we look forward. I I don't know where I'll be in 2040, but I would like to raise my hand if I'm in the coffin to say I was part of the declaration that was made in Durban. So we will call this a Durban minute, Dr. Ahmed. So thank you very much for the message. This means now I'm out of a job, Dr. Tutela, because I've brought this session on time to conclusion. So if you see me around with a begging hat, please put some dollars, euros. So I don't know the announcement for the opening of the exhibition, and then we're coming back for this lecture at 10:45, the one facilitated by Judy. So maybe Dr. Tutela can just guide us. From my side, thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you very much.
Good morning, delegates and our guests. And thank you, DG, for driving this morning for us. My task is very simple, is to firstly request all of you to stretch a little bit while we ask the DG and the delegates and the speakers that are here on the podium to go and officially open the exhibitions. It's going to take about 20 minutes at the max, and then we'll come back here and have another address. So please don't leave, stay with us while I ask the DG and Dr. Msomi to come with us to open the exhibitions. And then I'll give guidance afterwards on what's going to happen with the program. Thank you very much. to avoid some people missing out on who is going to be where, I will announce thereafter. But for now, I'm going to allow Dr. Judy Coates, who is going to introduce the next speaker and coordinate her presentation. And then thereafter, I will then walk you through the program for the day. Dr. Coates, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. It's a great honor to be able to introduce our next speaker. I think for many of us, she has been an icon of what the African Medicines Agency has been aiming to achieve. So without further ado, I'm trusting our speaker is out of the virtual lobby and with us. She's unfortunately not able to join us in person. Margaret Sagonda is really just someone that most of us, if you are in this particular arena, have interacted with over many years. She had a vision, and she has now brought that to fruition. Initially, it was in her role as the lead for the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization effort. And most of us are very familiar with all the acronyms, but we often don't know what the acronyms mean. And she really had this vision, and it was lovely to be able to follow Dr. Omar's presentation, as that initiative in terms of the Africa CDC was the first on the continent. And at that point in February 2019, where they announced that they would like to look at setting up ARMA, it was to be seen as the second such initiative on the continent. And it's really exciting to see that we're there today. So without further ado, I'm trusting we can let Margaret onto the stage. Thank you, the virtual stage.
Thank you, Judy, and thanks all the organizers for inviting me to share with you our information about the African Medicines Agency, but also thank you so much for the kind introduction. So my plan is to really share with you information on where we are with the establishment of the African Medicines Agency. I'm not sure, Judy, you want me to share my screen, right?
You do have your slides ready. Thank you. You're welcome to share.
Right, okay. So let me share my slide. And essentially, my plan is to really, you can see my screen, right?
Yes, thank you, we can.
Right. So my plan is to really give you a bit of background of where we've come from with the African Medicines Agency, before I can provide information as to where we are with the establishment. And for me to do that, I've actually organized my presentation in three sections. One is to tell you where I'm coming in from the African Union Development Agency point of view, the role that we have played in the whole process, and also tell you a bit about the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiative that Judy was referring to. And then I'll take you through the African Medicines Agency, the governance structure, the ratification process, and the scope of functions that we envisage that AMA will be able to undertake in the near future. So as a way of background, I think it's very important we understand that I'm working for the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, which is an AU body. The AUDA NEPAD has a mandate to, one, coordinate the implementation of priority regional and continental programs to promote regional integration across the continent. But secondly, the AUDA is responsible for strengthening the capacity of the AU member states and also the regional economic communities as part of really development agenda within the framework of Agenda 2063. But in addition to that, the AUDA NEPAD is responsible for providing knowledge-based and technical advisory support to all the AU member states and regional economic communities for implementation of the AU common policies and strategies. We are also responsible for monitoring and evaluating progress in terms of implementation of these programs, and also documenting best practice and sharing lessons among the member states across the continent as a way of promoting sustainable development. And last but not least, we also serve as a continent's technical interface with Africa's development stakeholders, including development partners, for integrated and inclusive development. And this is very important for me to share with you this because this is the origin for which the Air Marriage Initiative was sort of established. So if I take you through the history now, quickly of the Air Marriage Initiative, is that we started in 2009 with engaging the African national regulatory agencies and the regional economic communities to really try and see how can we address the fragmented regulatory systems across the continent. And as you may be aware, most of the countries that are struggling in one way or another, either because of weak legislative frameworks or financial or human resource capacities, and a lot of other problems that countries are facing. So we undertook to really engage the national agencies across the continent and the regional economic community to say, how can we address those regulatory challenges that Africa, the continent, is facing? So we agreed to work through the regional economic communities, harmonize technical requirements. We started with requirements for registration of generic medicines with a view to slowly expand the scope to also cover other products such as new chemical entities, vaccines, but also to expand the scope of regulatory functions to also address issues around inspection of manufacturing sites, also the pharmacovigilance and so forth and so forth. So we were able to pilot the program in East African Community, and after successful implementation which was launched in 2012, after successful implementation, then we were able to scale it up across the continent. We are now covering 5 regions across the continent, meaning SADC region, the Economic Community of West African region, the Economic Community of Central African region, but also the IGAD, which is in the Horn of Africa, covering more than 85% of sub-Saharan Africa. We are engaging as well the Northern African region, but through country engagement, because we've not been able to really work with the Arab Maghreb Union, which is a regional economic community for the Northern African region. And so through this process of harmonization of technical requirements, but also bringing countries together, undertaking joint review of those applications and inspection of manufacturing sites, we've seen tremendous progress in terms of really reduction of timelines that it takes for products to be placed on the market. We've also been able to assist countries to domesticate the AU model law for medical products regulation, which is, again, a very key tool to facilitate establishment of semi-autonomous agencies, but also to assist countries to be able to rely on regulatory decisions based on other agencies' decisions. So this has also been very instrumental. But in addition to that, we played a very key role in really advocating for the establishment of the African Medicines Agency through a treaty-based structure, and we were able to do that, of course, in collaboration with partners. WHO has been also very instrumental, and African Union Commission, and eventually we were able to, of course, get the endorsement in February 2019, and of course, as of last year, November, the AMA Treaty came into force, and I'll tell you more about where we stand with that process. We've also seen a lot of progress in terms of countries' regulatory agencies attaining maturity level 3. We have 4 countries at the moment, meaning Tanzania, Ghana, Egypt, and Nigeria, that have attained maturity level 3, which we are very proud of as a continent to say we're making good progress in terms of really strengthening the capacity of national regulatory agencies on the continent. We've also been able to designate 11 regional centers of regulatory excellence as the 2 that helps us to ensure that the academic institutions are working in collaboration with the regulatory agencies to produce regulatory workforce across the continent in advancing regulatory science and have the necessary expertise that we need to provide oversight on regulatory aspects across national, regional, and continental bodies. But I think I should also mention here that we have had a very robust governance structure that has enabled us to really make sure that we engage not only the heads of agencies, but also experts across the continent. They come together through either the regional processes or continental processes. They contribute their expertise, and we're able to see quite a number of guidelines produced, and member states are able to use those as a way of really undertaking their regulatory functions. We've also been able to support, of course, COVID-19 response using the MRH structures. And of course, we see countries coming together to facilitate, especially when it comes to emergency use approvals of vaccines and other related therapeutics across the globe. So this is where we've come from as the MRH. And as I'm speaking now, we have had a lot of partners that have really expressed interest to participate and contribute as part of the MRH partnership platform. And also based on this work that has happened, we've also gotten a decision of the African Union to say that the MRH should serve as a foundation for establishment of the African Medicines Agency. Now, having said that, we are at a point where now we are using the technical committees that have been established under the MRH initiative to do two things. One, to support the ongoing efforts of the African Union to advance vaccine manufacturing and attain 60% of the need by 2040. That's where we are. That MRH is now providing that regulatory oversight through we call it the Partnership for African Vaccine Manufacturing Framework, for which we are supporting the regulatory workstream to make sure that the needed technical support is provided so that vaccines that are going to be manufactured locally, they meet internationally acceptable standards of safety, quality, and efficacy. So we've been able to use, we have 4 technical committees that we have revived through this process. The AVAREF, this is the African Vaccine Regulatory Forum, which provides regulatory oversight on clinical trials and joint review of complex molecules, including vaccines. We've also revived the work of the African Medicine Quality Forum, which is responsible for supporting quality control laboratories. But also, in addition, we have revived the Good Manufacturing Practice GMP Technical Committee to again provide oversight on vaccine manufacturing facilities to attain GMP standards. And another technical committee that we have revived is the Regulatory Capacity Development, which is responsible for designating the regional centers of regulatory excellence. And our plan is to make sure that we also have centers of excellence that will provide oversight on vaccines regulatory aspect of things. So the whole idea is to say that these existing technical committees, currently we have 10 of them, but as I say, 4 of them have been revived to support vaccine, would eventually support the work of the African Medicines Agency once it becomes operational. Now let me take you through where we are with the African Medicines Agency. First of all, in terms of governance structure, the African Medicines Agency is, according to the treaty, it has like 4 layers of governance. You know, from the Conference of the State Parties constituted by the ministers responsible for health, from the countries that have already ratified the AMA Treaty and deposited their ratification instrument with the African Union Commission. They constitute the Conference of the State Party. And below it, there's a governing board. This is really a body that is responsible for strategic direction and also technical decision-making and providing guidance and monitoring the performance of AMA. This is yet to be constituted, and I'll give you more information as to where we stand on that. And then there will be a secretariat supported by technical committees. But of course, the secretariat will be led by the Director General, who will be responsible for the day-to-day operation of the African Medicines Agency. So this is how AMA is going to be constituted. Now, where are we in terms of AMA operationalization? Currently, we have 22 member states that have ratified the treaty, but also they have deposited the instrument of ratification with the African Union Commission. So AMA did come into force. The treaty actually came into force on the 5th of November last year. And the Conference of the State Party had their first meeting on the 1st to 2nd of June this year. And they agreed in principle on the governance mechanism. And Ghana, actually, the Republic of Ghana now serves as the chair of the Conference of the State Party. But also a decision in terms of the hosting of the AMA headquarters has been made in July, and the Republic of Rwanda is actually has been selected to host the African Medicines Agency headquarters. So what is going to happen is that there's going to be a convening of the extraordinary meeting of the AMA Conference of the State Parties sometime before the end of this year to really consider the constitution of the AMA Governing Board. And I think I must mention here, the AMA Governing Board will be constituted by heads of agencies representing, heads of national regulatory agencies representing the 5 geographic regions. So that is going to be constituted before end of this year, but also the Conference of the State Party will also consider the terms of reference for the AMA Director General before eventually the process of recruitment can start. So this is where we are with the AMA operationalization process. In terms of scope of the African Medicines Agency, if you go through the treaty, it is very clear that AMA will focus on a priority. The scope of AMA products will be sort of based on the priority that would have been agreed among the AU member states. These are highly complex products that will be considered by AMA. The rest of the products will be managed at either regional or national levels. So we are looking into either biotherapeutic products, vaccines, innovative new therapies, and also AMA will be responsible for managing public health emergencies in terms of really making sure that, during pandemics, then they're able to issue, authorization for priority products. And so this slide speaks to what AMA is expected to do. And of course, a lot of these decisions will be made once all the necessary structures of AMA are in place. But I think suffice to say here that we are already doing some work as AUDA, NEPAD, and partners to support the AMA operationalization process technically, using the existing technical committee that I mentioned before to see to it that when AMA becomes operational, then it has a smooth takeoff. So I think that is what I can say so far, in as far as the African Medicines Agency is concerned. And I think, this also takes me to the next slide that speaks to what other aspects that AMA can work on. In addition to the technical aspect of things, AMA is also expected to support countries to really attain the WHO maturity level 3, for them to really make sure that they have strong and robust regulatory systems and processes, because we believe that strong national regulatory agencies will make a strong African Medicines Agency. So AMA will also have to support them to attain ML3 status. As I mentioned before, currently we already have 4 countries, and we have more coming. We know South Africa is at a very advanced stage of attaining ML3 status. So we believe that once these countries have strong NRAs, we'll be in a very good position to make sure that they also help other countries to, and serve as alliance NRAs to support other countries to strengthen their system, but also to support the ongoing efforts on the continent of advancing local vaccine manufacturing across the continent. So I think I should stop here, and if there are any questions, then this is the time. Thank you once again for your attention.
Thank you very much, Margaret. That was a really elegant and exciting presentation, and I think we can hear the energy in your voice as you speak about this long-lived dream that is now coming to fruition. If I may steal just the words that Dr. Omar shared, and I mean, it's again the quote from Nelson Mandela, but what seems impossible until it's done. And I think this is the reality of where we're at. It's a crossroads for ARMA now where we're waiting for countries to all sign, to ratify and sign. And I think, you know, this is a really important step for many of you in the audience. If you're from South Africa, I know we've got a lot of African countries represented here today, but for the South Africans, South Africa is working really hard on their signing and ratification, and there is a target to have this done by November this year in terms of the signing. Obviously, then the ratification and depositing will follow that, but we're watching that space closely. But if I can now open to the floor, obviously you heard the earlier speakers that the lights are very bright, so if you can just come to the microphones in the center, they have been set up for you. But while we wait for people to come to the mic, I'm going to take the liberty, if I may, Margaret, to just ask you a first question. And maybe just if you can share with us, what would you say the key highlight is for you from the journey of 2019 to today? Margaret?
So Judy,
yeah, thank you.
Are you referring to the ARMA journey?
Yes, I am.
Right, so yeah, I think if we look at what has happened since the ARMA Treaty was adopted by the AU Assembly, the key highlight is the very fast process of ratification that we've seen with the ARMA compared to many other, treaty-based organizations. And after the African Continental Free Trade Area, a record ratification process, I think ARMA is the second that we've seen. And I think COVID-19 has really played a very key role to push countries to realize the need for them to put their efforts and resources together and make sure that ARMA becomes a reality. So that has been a very key highlight, very fast ratification process, many countries rallying behind the ARMA process. And we are also seeing a lot of enthusiasm. And I remember I attended the first meeting of the conference of the third party. You see countries committing to invest into the ARMA process, which I think is a very good thing that we need to take advantage of. And especially now that we are also moving into advancing vaccine manufacturing across the continent, ARMA becomes a very key instrument and tool to really assist countries to ensure that the regulatory environment is conducive for the industry to be able to invest on the continent. So those are the key highlights that I would really allude to. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm completely aligned with you that there are really great highlights. Are there any questions from the floor? Okay, I'll take the liberty then of asking one more question because we do have a few minutes, or we've got a minute or so. I know we've caught up some time, which is great. So just the last question, maybe just to close the session with you, Margaret, is what do you see the key challenge being in terms of once we have all the countries having signed and ratified, what do you see the key challenge being in terms of ARMA coming into effect?
I think when it comes to challenges, when ARMA comes into effect, one of the key challenges, I think, is the situation where we see countries struggling, especially with their national laws, to be able to rely rather on decisions made by other agencies, because countries have limited capacity in terms of expertise, and so they may not necessarily have the ability to undertake, some of the functions, for instance, approval of complex molecules, if I may take that as an example. And so you need to have a legal framework at a national level that allows a country to be able to rely on other decisions made by other regional platforms, but also the so-called stringent regulatory agencies. And this is where we are seeing countries struggling. And even, for instance, with the work that we have done through the regional economic communities to do the joint review of dossiers and joint GMP inspection, the biggest challenge has been the uptake at a national level of the outcome of the regional process in terms of the decision-making process. So I think this is an area that we need to work even harder to say, can we assist countries to review their laws so that they have a leeway of using other agencies' decision to really make quicker decisions, because the review process of that is happening at a regional level is very, very rigorous as compared to what most countries are able to do. So I think this is an area that we need to invest more and make sure that we have appropriate legal frameworks that would allow countries to have faster approval of products at a country level.
Cool. Thank you very much, Margaret. Thank you for availing yourself for our event, and we wish you well in the journey going ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all. I wish you all the best. Bye-bye.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Coates, for that, and thank you to Margaret. Colleagues, we're now going to split into the parallel sections, and those that want to stay with the healthcare innovation in the age of pandemics, please remain in the same hall that we're at, which is main hall or hall number 1. And people that want to go to the strategic capital mobilization and market access, go to room number 11, which is down the corridor on your right, I think, as you walk down. Food security is in room 12, which is just opposite to it. IK-based innovations is room 21, and which is one floor up. Entrepreneurship and startups are in room 22. The sessions will start at exactly 11:15 according to African time. So please, let's proceed there. Someone has lost their cell phone. It's called, I think it's called Huawei, whatever the name this is pronounced. So please talk to me or to your reception to get your phone. Thank you, colleagues.